So thank you all for joining us. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Andrew Abela to Thomas More for his first visit to the campus, although he's a longtime friend. Dr. Abela is here. He's the Dean of the Busch School of Business at the Catholic University of America, and he is the author of this volume, Super Habits, the Universal System for Successful Life. It's published by our friends at Sophia Institute, and there will be copies of the book available. Peter Granger, who is our videographer for the evening, is an alumnus of Thomas More. He works for Sophia, and he'll be offering the books for sale and for signing if you'd like them after the talk. I've been dipping into the book here and there, and I just want to read, I don't want to preempt what we were going to talk about, but the book is organized around various super habits, and the one that kind of caught my attention immediately is eutrapelia, which is the pursuit of leisure. And he goes through what we consider leisure activities and says, you need to find some activity that you'll enjoy for itself, where you're running a serious risk of not having the mental energy to engage the bigger questions in life. And he gives a sort of, for each of the virtues, figuring out, are you practicing, is this true leisure? And he gives examples of potential leisure activities require work before they can serve as leisure activities. When you first try to learn how to play guitar, for example, it's going to take work. But at a certain point, you become good enough that you can just pick up the guitar and start playing. And the main reason you do it is for the fun of it. Yes, each time you play it, you're practicing, so you're getting better. But that's no longer the main reason you're playing guitar. If the main reason you play guitar is now for the joy of it, then it's leisure, even if you're getting better each time you play. So there's a structure to the book that allows us to discern how we can improve in the virtues and how we can determine if we're making some progress or if we're just sort of doing something for the benefit of something else. So there will be a PowerPoint that accompanies the presentation, and I just wanted to say a few words about the center. So the Thomas More Center hopes to address the crisis of our age, the crisis of a civilization that has drifted from the principles on which it was founded. So the center has basically 5 areas that it focuses on. Those are education, culture, church teaching, civic life, and family life. And one of the reasons that I'm very grateful for Dr. Abela being here this evening is because I believe that the work that he's doing and the book that he's published focuses on all 5 of those areas. So education, culture, church teaching, civic life, and family life. And I also wanted to mention, as a kind of general announcement about the work of the center, there are many other lectures, and I know several of you have been to many of our lectures this fall. I have flyers for what we're doing in the spring. So the winter-spring lecture series has been set. We have only one more event that we've added on to our fall lecture series, and that is Dr. Phil Lawler is going to be coming December 16th. He has a new book out called Ghost Runners that's going to be published by Sophia. It's out November 18th, so we're going to have a book event on December 16th, so you're all welcome to come to that. And then in the spring, there's a full series of lectures, including the Catholic Literature Conference. So the date has been set for the Catholic Literature Conference. It's going to be April 25th. Like last year, it will be at St. Mary's Parish in Manchester. It's a full-day event. We have a full lineup of speakers, poet James Fancy Wilson, Dr. Matthew Meehan of Hillsdale College, Joseph Pierce is returning, and Dr. Jeremy Beer. So please save that date. The registration is not yet open for that, but it will be in the next couple of weeks. So there are flyers for both of those, the Winter Spring Lecture Series and the Catholic Literature Conference as the door that you came in. For those of you for the first time, if this is your first visit to the center, there is one restroom. It's at the back on the right. And there are refreshments that will be available after the talk. And if you have any questions, please see me after the talk. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Abela. Thank you.
Thank you all. Delighted to be here. Is this mic, like in the back? Can you hear me clearly? Okay, terrific, terrific. So I want to talk about the virtues, and I'm sure all of you know about the virtues. So I'm hoping to tell you something that perhaps you don't know, or you didn't know that you knew. Because I have found over the years that even very well-educated, well-formed people don't quite understand truly what virtue means. And if you'll permit me, I recognize this fellow, Inigo Montoya, with apologies to him. That word virtue, you do not think it means what you think it means. Unless you think I'm joking. So here are 4 definitions from popular dictionaries. We look at sort of good moral quality, or virtuous conformity to a standard of right, or thinking and deciding kind of what is right or wrong. A moral quality regarded as good. And so when we say be virtuous, we normally think it means be good. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with, and if you put me another silly movie, a more accurate definition of virtue is be excellent, not just be good. And it's not just a question of superlative. When we say be good, we usually understand that as purely a moral exhortation, be a good person. But when we say be excellent, it has a broader impression. That it's not just about moral excellence, but just excellence throughout everything that we do as human beings, including the practical things that we do. So excellence is a very practical thing, and so virtue is a very practical thing. And so the most important thing to know about a virtue, and I'm going to bring back the slide with the definitions on it, the most important thing to know about a virtue is missing from these definitions from supposedly the best dictionaries available in the English language. Anybody care to guess? What is, in one word, what is the most important thing to know about a virtue that is not appearing in any of these definitions? Anybody care to hazard? That a virtue is a habit. Makes sense, right? But it doesn't appear in any of these definitions. Virtue is a habit. See, I told you I'd tell you some new things about virtue. But you knew that, A virtue is a good habit that makes you good, that anybody can develop. And in fact, the virtues are kind of like superpowers, which is why I called my book Super Habits. They give us the capacity or the ability to do things that we didn't think that we were able to do or able to do easily. Let me try to illustrate this with a cheap pull at your emotions. So this is my eldest daughter and my first grandson, Owen. And so Owen, some time ago, was learning to walk. So this is Owen taking his first steps. I want you to watch him again. I'll do it in slow-mo this time. See? Look at him, tongue between his teeth. Do you see the intensity, right, with which he's taking every single step? And yet, within a short number of weeks, he's out there mowing the lawn. Why? Because the practice of walking has become habit for him. So from that kind of teeth clenching, tongue biting, extreme concentration on every step, to walking without giving it a second thought, because it's become a habit. And now, there have been a number of popular books about habits. The one in the middle, particularly popular, sold many millions of copies. I should be so lucky. How many of you have heard of these, any of these books? Yeah, okay. Very popular, and deservedly so, because I think we had forgotten how important habits are. Some very recent research shows that if you want to change human behavior, your own or somebody else's, the most powerful way to change behavior is through developing habits. It's more powerful than education, more powerful than advertising, more powerful than storytelling. It's habits. And so it's not a surprise really that these books have become so popular, because they work. So now I have another question for you. So those of you who read these books or heard of these books, how many of you in this room are currently or have recently tried to develop a new habit? Intentionally, just a show of hands if you have. Okay, a bunch of you, like the majority, I think. I'm going to make a guess, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that this habit that you have been working on is one of these three kinds: diet, exercise, or sleep. Am I right? Yes, okay. Well, we'll have one no. I'll ask you later on what yours is. Well, I won't, because maybe you don't want to share it. But anyway, the vast majority, and every time I give a talk like this, I ask this question, the vast majority of habits are habits of diet, exercise, and sleep. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong with that. It's good to have good diet, it's good to exercise, good to sleep well, important for our health. But diet, exercise, and sleep are what we have in common with the animals. Right? Animals eat, animals move, animals sleep. Are there habits that are unique to us as human beings? So again, nothing wrong with diet, exercise, and sleep. But why stop there? There are higher habits that we can develop as human beings. I'll give you an example. Gratitude, the habit of being grateful. I know that given Thomas More and given the culture, the very healthy culture that you have, you're not inclined to look to social science as the source of any kind of truth. But most people are. And so to convince most people, I make the argument that there have actually been extensive empirical studies of gratitude, and they find some interesting things. They find that as one grows in gratitude, you become more grateful. This is what social science is really good at. As somebody once said, proving what is blindingly obvious. but other things they do find that are also interesting. It becomes easier to be grateful as you develop the habit, in the same way that when it was easier for him to walk once he had the habit of walking, it's easier to be grateful once you have the habit of gratitude. You also become happier. Now, the ancients told us that as you grow in any virtue, like the virtue of gratitude, you become happier. But now we have, in case somebody didn't want to believe the ancients, modern social science proves the same thing. And something still more, that you become healthier. So this is interesting, that how does gratitude make you healthier, both mentally and physically healthier? So the kinds of studies I'm referring to here will take two groups of people and try to match them roughly equally in terms of age and background and education and so on. And then they will have one group grow in gratitude by keeping a gratitude journal, a gratitude diary, every day, usually in the evening, but could be in the morning, writing down things that you are grateful for. And this has been shown to help people grow in gratitude. And when they do this for 60, 70 days, and then they ask people to sort of report, and you compare the two groups, the gratitude journal people and the other group, the folks who have been keeping the gratitude journal will report being happier, but also having lower incidence, say, of anxiety or depression, so improved mental health, and lower incidence of chronic pain, for example. So as I was doing this research, I had a really bad attack of sciatica. It was so bad, it was back pain, and all down to my leg. So bad, all I could do for about a week was lie flat on my back, on my bed, and do email on my phone. That's basically how I kept my job going. And no one wants to spend the rest of their life doing that, so I tried every possible solution. I had a prescription for there was steroids, I had physical therapy, I even subjected myself to acupuncture, and I started a gratitude diary, because I thought, hey, maybe this stuff will work. And you know what, the pain went away. And I said to my wife, look, this gratitude diary is very powerful. She said, nonsense, that's probably the steroids, probably the acupuncture, who knows? But I kept the diary going for several weeks and months, and I was free of back pain, and then I stopped the diary, thinking I was grateful enough, and the back pain came back. And I started the diary again, and it went away. So that's just one person, but the research does suggest that as people grow in gratitude, you become healthier as well as happier. So that's interesting. But it's not just about gratitude. So here's another one. So honesty is a habit, is a virtue. Lots of research about honesty that tells us that as you grow in the habit of honesty, you become more honest, no surprise. But it becomes easier to be honest. It becomes easier to answer difficult questions, honestly, rather than being tempted to answer with a white lie. You could become happier and you become healthier. Another example, the virtue of restraint. The habit of restraint, the ability to say no to an impulse that if you didn't say no to, you probably regret. Somebody says something annoying to you and you want to say something unkind back. The virtue of restraint will restrain you from doing that. Or you're playing around on a computer as you shouldn't be, and you're on Amazon and you see a big sale and you click the buy button, and then you regret it. So the virtue of restraint, tons of research that shows us that you become more restrained, it's easier to restrain yourself, you become happier and you become healthier. Now, people who do this kind of research tend to spend years, maybe even decades, studying the same virtue. So I know one fellow who spent his entire career studying the habit of forgiveness, became a world expert on forgiveness from a secular point of view. What very few people do is read across the literatures, as I've been doing. And so I don't think very many people notice this pattern. The same results, no matter what the virtue is, makes you happier, makes you healthier, makes it easier. And so I kept seeing this again and again and again. Humility. The virtue of humility makes you more humble, easier to be humble, makes you happier, makes you healthier. Who knew this? Yeah? So I call all these super habits because of these amazing effects that they have. How are they different from any other habit, like brushing your teeth or wearing a seatbelt or making your bed? So if you make your bed, you're in the habit of making your bed, how many of you are in the habit of making your bed every morning? Okay, it's a good habit. It's a good habit to have. It makes it easier to make your bed, because if you're in the habit, you just make your bed without struggling to do that. It gives you a tidy bed, right? Isn't that good? But that's all it gives you. Whereas the habit of, say, courage, you can use on the football field, or when giving a speech, or in an interview. But the habit of making your bed just is good for making your bed. Doesn't make you happier, except maybe for a brief second or so. Hey, my bed's made, yay. Move on to the next thing. It doesn't have the same lasting effect as the virtues do, and it doesn't make you healthier. So that's the big difference between regular habits, that the 3 habits books, the Atomic Habits and Power of Habit and so on are talking about, and what I'm calling the super habits, otherwise known as the virtues. That they have this power to make you happier, to make you healthier. Now, you might respond and say, okay, fine, so people who are grateful, restrained, humble, honest, have happier, healthier, and easier lives. That's what the research is telling us. But how does that help me if I am ungrateful, impulsive, a little bit arrogant, and I sometimes blame the truth a little bit, right? It's just the way I am. So how does that help? And that's where you would be completely wrong. Because these are habits that anyone can acquire. And so if somebody says, well, I tend to be ungrateful, you are not genetically doomed to be ungrateful for the rest of your life. You just haven't developed the habit of gratitude yet, and anybody can. These Atomic Habits books and so on, I'll talk later about how you go about doing that, but anybody can do that. If somebody's impulsive, it's not in their nature to be impulsive, permanently so, they just have yet to develop the virtue, the super habit of restraint. If somebody's egotistical, they have yet to develop the virtue of humility. It's not just the way they are. And if somebody struggles to tell the truth, it's not because they are doomed to be a chronic liar, they just have yet to develop the virtue of honesty, and anybody can through practice. But I won't even stop there. I talk about this being very practical. If somebody is very disorganized, messy, that's just not the way you are, as people would describe it. So-and-so is a very messy person, or I'm very disorganized, I struggle to kind of get things done, and so on. You just have yet to develop the virtue of orderliness. And anyone can. Anyone. If somebody's not creative, and they say, no, I'm just not a very creative person, so that's a super habit, a virtue as well, which you can develop through practice. Likewise, somebody who's overly cautious has to practice the virtue of courage and will grow in that virtue. So I think it's a very optimistic perspective here, and I think an important one, because we tend to categorize ourselves and other people by being creative or organized or being a fraidy cat or whatever. And yet these are all things that any human being can grow in. Anyone can grow in any of the super habits, any of the virtues. And here's the really, really good news. So I was talking to a friend of mine who was a teacher at a boys' high school, the Heights in Potomac, Maryland, and he also doubles as the climbing coach. And he was saying to me, every year he takes a new crop of boys out for their first time rock climbing. And he says, and the next day they invariably come to him and say, sir, muscles I didn't even know I had are killing me. Maybe you've had that experience, you try a new sport or something, muscles I didn't even know I had. Well, the virtues are mental muscles you didn't even know you had. Because every human being, as part of our human nature, has all of the virtues in themselves. They're just like muscles that have yet to be exercised. So it's not like you're trying to bring in something foreign to you, like calculus, for example. It's there already. We all have it in us, the power to be courageous, to be creative, to be just, and so on. It's just a matter of exercising that muscle a little bit at a time so that it grows. So how do we do that exactly? How do we develop a virtue? We take a bite-sized approach. So if you look at the book Atomic Habits, and actually all the habits books, they make generally 3 points, sometimes more, but they boil down to these 3 points. You want to take the thing that you're trying to grow in, and first make it easy by taking just a little bite size out of it. Don't try to do the whole thing at once. If you struggle with telling the truth, you don't start the next day giving the complete, honest truth to everybody, because you'll probably stumble, and then you'll fall back. But you just pick a little thing. Say, okay, under certain conditions, I usually find it difficult when somebody says, well, I want to give you an example. Imagine your own. I'm just going to pick a small bite-sized piece that I can do, and then I'll practice that every day. Eventually that will become a habit, and in a matter of weeks typically, it'll become a habit. It won't be hard anymore. I can take another bite and enlarge it, and slowly, step by step, you grow. The second is make it obvious, make it something that you can remember to do every day. And the third is make it rewarding. Now, as my mother told me, virtue is its own reward. So as people grow in virtue, they start enjoy the habit to practice more. But if you can, it's okay, and this is important to know in raising children, it's okay to bribe people into virtuous behavior. Sometimes we're afraid because it's like, okay, they will get attached to the extrinsic reward, and they won't actually grow in the virtue. The research I've seen, and it's quite convincing, is that the joy of growing in virtue is such that even when you pull away, you withdraw the external reward, the habit remains. So those are the 3 things to remember: easy, obvious, rewarding, and the first one is the most important. Pick a little bite-sized piece. So I'll give you an example. So you want to grow in the virtue of humility. So I want to grow in humility. One exercise that's been recommended and tested and seems to work really well is once a day, when you're facing a decision of any sort, big or small, try to make a list of all the things you don't know about that decision, about its inputs, its possible consequences, and so on. You do that regularly, day by day, and you'll grow in the virtue of humility. It will become part of you. That's why we refer to virtue as second nature. You strengthen that muscle, it'll become part of your character. Because character, as we know, is nothing other than the collection of virtues that we have. So if you want to better improve your character, you just keep building up individual virtues. This is a reminder, I think you know this, that every virtue has two opposing, or almost every virtue has two opposing vices. So on one end, sort of too little, and the other end too much, so deficiency or excess. So even humility, most commonly, the vice opposing humility is pride, where we have an overinflated view of ourselves and our abilities. Because by humility we mean not thinking less of yourself, but having an accurate perception of yourself and your abilities. So the one extreme, excess, is to have too inflated a view of yourself, and the other extreme is to have a too kind of degraded or low view of yourself that is inadequate, is not true, is also a vice, opposed to humility. So how do you grow? The ancients taught us that you cannot jump from a vice or a bad habit directly to a virtue or a good habit, because the strength of a bad habit is such that it will keep pulling you back. So you can't just sort of make the leap. That's what I talk about, this sort of bite-sized approach. The ancients taught us that there are two intermediate steps that you have to go through on the way from vice to virtue, and those steps are called, unfortunately, incontinence and continence. And I say unfortunately because those words have a slightly different meaning these days to do with bladder control. So I use an alternative phrasing that I draw from kind of skill development theory, where when we speak about vice, we can speak about a state of unconscious incompetence. So let's say somebody is a chronic liar, right? So they do not have the virtue of honesty in the least. They just tell lies all the time. And so it's a state of unconscious incompetence. They're incompetent with respect to the virtue of honesty, with respect to telling the truth. And they're unconscious in that they don't even know that. They don't even know that they lack this as a virtue. In fact, probably what they think is they're being pretty smart, because they can outsmart anybody else, because we're all suckers moving around telling the truth, whereas they will lie to get whatever they need. So they think that's pretty savvy, So that's a state of unconscious incompetence. However, if they are lucky, if they are blessed, they have good friends, or unlikely in this case, they may realize people don't like hanging out with me. People don't like to do business with me. Gee, I wonder if this lying is not as good of a strategy as I thought. And that puts them in a state of conscious incompetence. They now realize that I'm lacking in this virtue. And I'm going to try to do something about it. So they try telling the truth. But the power of the habit is such that more often than not, they will fail. They will try to tell the truth, but under pressure, they'll just slip back into the old strategy of lying. However, if they persevere and they keep trying, eventually they will reach a stage of conscious competence, where they're trying to tell the truth, and more often than not, they will actually tell the truth. But it's still a struggle. They still have to struggle to tell the truth. It's still an effort. So they're not yet reached the level of virtue, which is the fourth stage of unconscious competence. So now they are in the habit of telling the truth. There isn't that effort anymore. They just naturally always tell the truth. They have become a truthful person. They have the virtue of honesty. This is a very encouraging message, because particularly for young people, you can sometimes from a distance look at the life of virtue and think, that just seems really hard. That just seems like a drag. Because I struggle now with a particular virtue, and I look forward and I see a lifetime of struggle. And I think, that's just not very fun. It reminds me of a joke that a friend of mine used to tell. He would say, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was no. And it just makes the whole life of faith look really distressing. It's like, everything is about no, and I can't do the things I want to do to do things I can't do, But when you realize that as one grows in virtue, and I'll dig more into this, one's desires actually change, one's habits change, so that we start to want to do the right thing, and we start to do the right thing effortlessly. And so that's why virtuous people are happy, because they want to do the right thing, and they're able to do the right thing effortlessly. So they have lots of friends, and they tend to be more successful, and so on. Sometimes they get crucified, but that's always a risk. But just generally speaking, it makes life easier and happier. So if I was offering to sell you a pill that would make your life easier and happier and have no bad side effects, like how many people would want it? I hope all of you would want it, right? That's what this is. That's what these superpowers, that's what these virtues are. And yet, because we've kind of lost the sense of this, we don't hear much about the virtues, or not enough anyway. Because it's not even just a case of, okay, I'm going to get me some of these super habits, some of these virtues, my life will be better. Whatever someone is struggling with in life, there is a virtue for that. And it's already inside of you. But you just have to exercise it. Because these habits, so the virtues, the habits that are unique to our humanity, cover our entire human experience. And here I'm following the work of St. Thomas Aquinas in his treatise on the virtues. Way back during COVID, when we were all locked down, I normally drive an hour and 15 minutes each way to get to Catholic University and back. So 2.5 hours a day in traffic. And so I had 2.5 hours a day extra during the lockdowns, you know, so it was no bad. And I thought, well, what's a good business dean going to do with those extra 2.5 hours? I thought, well, read the Summa, right? So I read particularly the treatise on the virtues, and it was not the first time I read it, but I never read it sort of front to back before. As I went through it, I started to realize that what Aquinas was doing was not just giving us a list of virtues. He was giving us an entire system, showing how all the virtues fit together, such that there's sort of no overlaps and no gaps. And so that's how we can say whatever problem somebody is struggling with, whatever human problem, there is going to be a virtue for that. Because there's no part of life where there isn't a proper virtue to fit that. And so I'm going to pick up his story part of the way and point out that we'll start with habits of thought, action, and feeling. Now, Aquinas would say, in our normal translations, intellect, will, and passion. But I'm kind of simplifying the language here. So there are habits of thought, action, and feeling that Aquinas identifies that helps us make decisions, relate to others, and manage our emotions. But if these habits are missing, and they are missing from so many, particularly of our young people, then they are just like my little grandson Owen, where they're struggling to make any difficult decision. They're struggling with any kind of relationship. So no wonder few of young people are getting married, for example, and they're struggling to manage their emotions. So no wonder we have a pandemic of anxiety and depression among young people. Because all of these things that would be easy for somebody who is virtuous are a really big struggle for somebody who isn't. So they just get burned out from the everyday requirements of life, of interacting, dealing with emotions, making decisions, and so on. So Aquinas is showing us how all these different virtues line up with the habits of sort of thinking, taking action, and feeling. So for thinking, then he makes one further subdivision in this, and he says he's going to group our feelings into two kinds. We have so many different kinds of emotions, so many different kinds of feelings. He just groups them into two kinds. Feelings of repulsion, so feelings that push us away from things would be our fears, and then feelings of attraction that pull us towards things or people or situations, he would call desires. So for the aspects, so I want you to see here his observation that if we're talking about our practical day-to-day living, so I'm not talking about the life of the mind or the life of the spirit here. I'm just talking about daily, practical, everyday living, going to work, going to school, interacting at home, and so on. We think, we take action, and we experience emotions. And that's comprehensive. That covers everything going on in our lives. So I challenge you to come up with anything kind of beyond that. And so then he observes, he says, okay, prudence or practical wisdom is the habit of making wise decisions. And so that governs pretty much all of our thinking day to day, because our day-to-day practical thinking is usually ordered to making a decision. What should I eat? What should I wear? What should I do? What should I say? What do I do next? You know? The virtue of justice, the habit of always treating others fairly, is what governs all of our actions. The virtue of fortitude or courage is the habit of moving forward even though you're afraid. Courage doesn't mean having no fear. Fear is an emotion that just arises spontaneously. Courage is saying, okay, fear has arisen, I'm still going to do the thing that I need to do. And then self-discipline or temperance is the virtue for dealing with our desires. It is the habit of only following our desires when it makes sense to do so. So notice this. If one has these 4 virtues, then all of one's everyday practical living is taken care of. We are living with excellence. Because all of our thoughts, all of our actions, all of our emotions are properly governed. So in case you ever wondered why are there 4 cardinal virtues, now you know. Because these 4 are what we need to govern our everyday lives. Now, the one challenge with that is that each of these virtues is a big one. It could take years to grow in the virtue of justice. So what do we do in the meantime? This is where Aquinas is helpful again. He says if we look at each of the cardinal virtues, we'll see that they have a whole bunch of what we call partial parts, other virtues that kind of roll up to the cardinal virtues. So courage, the habit of moving forward even though you're afraid, he divides into habits for overcoming and habits for enduring challenge or difficulty, things that would inspire fear. Because some things in life, some challenges in life can be overcome, and so we should overcome them. Others have to be endured. So let's say you have some difficult homework, a paper due, and that's a scary thing, and then you just tackle it and you overcome it and you're done with the paper. But you might also have a sickness, some kind of chronic sickness, which you try to get healed and you can't, and so then you have to just endure that. Aquinas goes further and says things that can be overcome in 2 ways, either with great human effort or by spending lots of money. He's a very practical guy. And so there's a virtue for each of those. And the virtue of magnanimity, mania anima, great soul, is the habit of zealously tackling big challenges. And it's a type of courage. And then munificence is a habit of spending large amounts of money for a good cause. It has to be your own money. There's no virtue for spending other people's money. It is the only virtue that Aquinas identifies that not everybody can practice. So you have to have lots of money in order to be munificent. It's different from generosity. Generosity, we'll come to in a second, is a part of justice. So by justice, we should be generous, but munificence is an act of courage. It's interesting that the more money you have, apparently, it seems like the more courage you need to give away large chunks of it. It's strange. You think the more you have, the more you can afford to give away, and you can. But somehow, it just seems more difficult. And then for endurance, there are physical and mental challenges that we have to endure. For physical would be perseverance. For mental would be resilience. Now, I should explain, for some of these virtues, I've been using different words. Sometimes I give you the alternative. So for prudence, I prefer practical wisdom. Because for most people, when they think of the word prudence, it doesn't sound, they don't think of it in terms of the original, what prudentia meant was the habit of making wise decisions. They think of prudence as being maybe a little timid, you know. Or temperance, I call self-discipline, because most of us think now of temperance solely to do with alcohol. You know, but temperantia, the Latin, meant self-discipline across all desires, not just a desire for alcohol. And it's the same with the virtue for enduring mental suffering. The word we normally use is patience, from the Latin patientia. But when we think of the word patience, we think of, don't be in a hurry, don't be in a rush, you know. That's not at all what Aquinas meant by patientia. He meant, the definition he gives is endurance through long sorrow. Endurance through long sorrow. So it's a mental suffering, kind of enduring mental suffering. And we have a better word for that now in English, and we call it resilience. We study it extensively, and we see how it's really important to human flourishing. And indeed, if any of you are familiar with something called cognitive behavioral therapy, I was talking to a doctor who was studying this at an advanced level, and he said that the latest types of cognitive behavioral therapy are almost indistinguishable from the virtue of resilience. That's basically growing in the virtue of resilience is equivalent to practicing cognitive behavioral therapy. So 750 years after Aquinas, we're sort of rediscovering what he told us back then. So this is the virtue of courage and its parts, the sort of 4 virtues that if one is trying to grow in courage, you don't try to grow in courage itself, you just pick one of these 4 and work on that. So for example, for our students who are trying to grow in resilience, and I think most young people would really benefit from this, one of the exercises that I love to assign is for the next 60 days, each day you have to ask one person a question where the answer is going to be no. So because most young people, they hear the no and they just wilt, And we want them to learn that no doesn't kill you, It just gives you a little bit of discomfort, but you can get used to that discomfort and keep growing. And so you go to a store and ask them if they carry a certain brand that you don't know they carry, and you feel foolish, and you get over it. Or you go to one of your professors and ask for an extension when you know this professor never gives extensions. And they say no. Or you go ask a girl out, God forbid, on a date, She says no. Young men I know will not ask a woman out on a date without checking through back channels to make sure she's going to say yes. So they don't expose themselves to that no. But it's good to expose yourself to no because it helps you build that muscle of resilience. So 4 different virtues that make up courage, according to Aquinas. I want to talk briefly about the virtue of self-discipline, we used to call temperance, where courage is made up of, or has 4 parts, self-discipline has 15. 15 virtues Aquinas gives us for dealing with 15 different types of human desire. So a different virtue for each type of desire. I'm going to warn you what comes next. I'm going to go through all 15. Is a bit of a drinking from a fire hose, so hang in there. So the virtue of self-discipline. He draws a distinction. So we have physical desires, and these are our strongest desires. Desires for nourishment, for food and drink, desires for sex, and desires for possessions. Now these are the strongest desires, he says, because these are the desires that keep the human race going. Right? If we don't eat, we die. If we don't reproduce, the human race dies out. And if we don't have things, it's very hard to live. If we don't have a home to live in, clothes to wear, tools to use, and so on. And so in terms of our desires for possessions, he says we desire more, and then we desire better or finer. Right? We always want more things and nicer things. And then there are other, we call them non-physical desires. That doesn't refer to the experience of the desire, but what we are desiring. So we have desires for what we want. We want to do things. We want to do petty things and great things. So petty things is like somebody cuts me off on the highway and I want to yell at them. That's sort of petty thing. But I also have desires to do great things. We want to evangelize the world. We want to build new buildings. We want to build hospitals. We want to serve the poor and so on. That's a desire as well. We also have desires to know things. We have desires to be in control. We have desires to be in control in the moment when something bad is happening, and we have desires to be in control after the fact. It sounds irrational, but I bet we've all had this. So this last one, to be in control, is really about anger. When do we get angry? When things aren't going the way that we think they should go, and then we remain angry when things didn't go the way we thought they should have gone. So I'll come back to that one. And then we have desires for how we want to live as well, how we want to work, to play, to move, and I say socially and physically. So we have desires that would make us socially unacceptable if we fulfill them, like picking your nose or scratching yourself in strange places. And then we have desires to like slouch on a chair, for example, that are unhealthy. Then the last is desire for how we want to dress, what we want to wear. So Aquinas identifies a virtue for each of these. So if anybody's struggling with any one of these, there's a virtue for that. So the virtue of abstemiousness, sometimes called abstinence, but that gets confused with chastity. So abstemiousness is the habit of having a right relationship with food. Feasting when it's time to feast, fasting when it's time to fast, and then eating just what is necessary at all other times. For drink is the virtue of sobriety, which is having understanding how much you can drink before you start to get silly and stopping before that. Chasteness or chastity, which is confining sexual activity into marriage. In terms of possessions, thrift and contentment are the habits of being happy with the amount of stuff you have and then the quality of stuff you have. I already mentioned restraint, so that's the habit for restraining oneself, one's impulses to do petty things. And then humility, we also talked about, that moderates our desire to do great things. And you would say, well, why would you want to moderate? Well, why not just give in to the desire to do great things? And the answer to that is, if we do that without humility, we can take on projects that are way beyond our ability, and then end up wasting time, right? Wasting other people's time, wasting our own efforts. Which is not to say you shouldn't stretch yourself, but you should have a clear-eyed view of what is reasonably possible. And things that are unreasonable, you shouldn't take on right now. The desire to know is the virtue of diligence. And I want to illustrate with this virtue, I think, a really, really important point that Aquinas makes at some length. So each of these virtues of self-discipline are all moderating a certain desire. But they are doing it in a way that doesn't rely on willpower. Okay? So the desire to know things becomes a vice when it's kind of aimless curiosity. So doom scrolling, 3 hours on your phone looking through whatever the social media site of the week is. The solution to that is neither to eliminate that desire, stifle that desire, kind of stuff that desire completely, nor to give it free rein, right? It is to try to coach that desire into a healthier, more productive direction. Now, once again, so this is quite 750 years ago. When I look at the latest scholarship on education, on how to cultivate diligence in young people and adults, the advice that you get is help them to fall in love with the thing that they're studying. So that's how we grow in diligence. It's not by kind of white-knuckling our way through the particular discipline. It's by learning to fall in love with that discipline. So redirecting our desire away from stuff that is a waste of time towards the thing that we want. Again, this is a very optimistic view, because what it's saying is the desires we have within us aren't evil. They're God-given. They sometimes go astray. But the cultivation of virtue is redirecting those desires in the right place. So you're not spending the rest of your life just kind of agonizing, because I feel like doing this thing, but I can't, you know. The feeling like doing this thing starts to go away, and instead you feel like doing the thing that you should be doing. Isn't that great? Just give you an example. It's a little maybe random. I used to suffer from terrible migraines. Bad back, bad head. It's a terrible migraines. And I used to love chocolate. I was the world's greatest chocoholic. And friends would say, maybe, chocolate's a trigger, migraines. Maybe that's the cause. And I was like, I don't care. I could not imagine a world where I would eat chocolate, even if it meant I had to go through migraines for the rest of my life. Until it came to the point where every Sunday we would take the kids out for donuts, and I would have a couple of chocolate donuts. And every Monday morning, a migraine would hit. And at that point, I couldn't ignore it anymore. So I was talking to a doctor, and I said, but I can't, if there's chocolate in the house, I'm weak, I can't resist the chocolate. And she said, you know what chocolate desire is, or craving? She said, it's a craving for magnesium, because there's magnesium in chocolate. So why don't you take magnesium supplements and see what happens? And so I started taking magnesium supplements, and the chocolate craving went away. Isn't that cool? So I haven't had chocolate in 15 years. I don't care. It's amazing. I never thought it was possible. Now, this is an analogy, right? I'm not saying there's a pill for solving vices, But it's just to illustrate what it feels like when that desire goes away or is redirected. Is that making sense? Give you another example, more to the point. We think of self-discipline as a function of willpower. But it's helpful to think of willpower like a gas tank. Every time you exercise willpower, you're drawing down gas from that tank. Certain point in the day, and maybe you've experienced this, the tank is empty. And you just can't make a decision anymore, can't do something difficult anymore because you're worn out. And it's not until you have a good night's sleep that you can the tank gets filled up again. So that's willpower. Self-discipline is a muscle, not a gas tank. The more you exercise self-discipline, the stronger that muscle gets. See the difference? So if you're always relying on willpower, you're doomed to that experience of running out at a certain point. Whereas if you start to rely on self-discipline, which is this redirection of your desire into a more healthy place, then that's just going to get stronger and life is going to get easier. So I think that's very encouraging. Okay, where was I? Control. I mentioned that anger arises when Things aren't going the way we think they should go. And the virtue that I want to share here is one that you've probably never heard of, called gentle firmness. And the reason you never heard of it is I just made it up. Because the word is, the Latin word is mansuetudo, and it's usually translated as meekness. But to the modern ear, meekness sounds like weakness, and is not something that people want to aspire to. But the traditional meaning of meekness, Christ is meek and humble of heart, there's no weakness in him. What meekness really means, hence the name I gave it, is the ability to be strong and gentle at the same time. So to be unyielding and firm, but do it in a nice way. Visualize the steel fist in a velvet glove, And it's the proper antidote to anger. Somebody who has anger management problems. Again, the two extremes with anger would be one, stuff the anger, push it away, it's bad, push it away, super unhealthy, right? The other extreme is let it blow out, explode, doesn't do anybody any good, right? And so what is the virtue of gentle firmness look like? It's to feel the anger and use it as energy against the thing that caused the anger in the first place, right? Which could be one of two things. So things aren't going the way you want them to go. Either because you have the wrong idea of what the way they should go, in which case use the anger to force yourself to reflect, okay, gee, I could be really wrong here, very bad wrong. Or things aren't going the way because there's some injustice going on, in which case then you really need to stand up for that. And the anger is going to be your energy. Make sense? Okay. So that's in the moment. After the fact, when something bad happens, something went the way it shouldn't go, it is said, that when somebody did something offensive to you, and you're hanging on to it, it's like they're living rent-free in your head. They're there, just weighing on you, sitting in the attic. They probably don't even remember what they did, but they're just dragging you down. And so the virtue here is forgiveness. Forgiveness, the habit of saying, I forgive them, and when you forgive them, you evict them from your head. You can just kind of move on with life. And then several other virtues. So for work is the virtue of orderliness, for play is eutropelia, which Amy mentioned before, for social movement, and then for healthy movement, and then for dress would of course be modesty. And so if anybody's been trying to grow in self-discipline and finding it difficult, now you know why, because you've been trying to grow in 15 different virtues at the same time, effectively, right? So just pick one. Maybe it's diligence, or maybe it's modesty, or whatever. And so we had courage and its 4 virtues, we had self-discipline and we had 15 virtues. There's also, that would be justice, has 10 virtues. So I mentioned generosity, gratitude, and so on, are all types of justice virtues. And then prudence or practical wisdom has 8 virtues. Aquinas groups them into virtues for gathering information, 1 virtue for reasoning through that information, to draw conclusions, and then 3 virtues for turning those conclusions into action. I don't expect you to read any of these, but I'll give you a handout soon. And it's really interesting, again, if you look at Aquinas' virtues of practical wisdom for decision-making, I compare that with a contemporary decision-making textbook, and they line up remarkably well. There's so much wisdom in it. And so you take all of these, and you put them all together, and you get this visualization. Again, I know you can't read that. Is Amy here? Could you hand them out? Yeah. I don't think we have enough, so maybe 1 between 2. What this is some of you may have seen the medieval pictures of the tree of the virtues, which show you the cardinal virtues and then the other partial virtues are branches. Far be it for me to criticize the medievals, but I don't like the tree visualization because you could always imagine another branch coming out in between branches, whereas a circle is complete. And the way to read this, so you can use the handout to actually read the words, but if you can follow me on the screen, you can see where I'm trying to point you to, because there's a lot of stuff on that. It can seem a little overwhelming. So what I'll try to take you through here is the structure of Aquinas' treatise on the virtue as visualized by me. And the reason this is so important is if you've read multiple books on the virtues, and there are many good ones written by good faithful Catholics, so Romano Guardini has one, my old boss John Darby has one, Donald DeMarco has one. Fabulous books about the virtues. Every one of them has a slightly different list of virtues. And you think, well, that's odd, like, are these things real or not? And if so, how come we can't agree on what they are? Imagine we were studying chemistry, and every chemistry book you read had a slightly different periodic table of elements. This one has sodium, but this one doesn't, but it has iron, and this doesn't, that wouldn't make any sense. So, if virtues are important, why don't we have a complete set? And Aquinas gives us that complete set. And the reason we know it's complete is he starts out from all of human life, which is why I draw kind of a circle. They're saying that represents all of human life. And then he makes finer and finer distinctions. So the first distinction he makes is between our spiritual and material lives, supernatural and natural lives. And so what I do, each of the rings around that circle, moving outwards, is a distinction that Aquinas made. So in the first distinction, he then gives us the virtues for the supernatural life, so the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. So then what remains of that yellow, supposed to be golden ring, he then makes a second distinction within that between our intellectual and our practical lives. And so our intellectual lives have their own virtues, wisdom, science, understanding, and art. People debate about art, but that's okay. I want to focus on the rest of it, the practical side of life. There are our thoughts, actions, and feelings. I think I mentioned before. And then they have prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. So we've got the fears and desires, prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. So those are the four cardinal virtues lining up. And then we go through, as I was doing before. So we take the different virtues, in this case, of courage, if you remember. And you keep subdividing and subdividing. So this is what I had before. So you had the virtues for overcoming, virtues for enduring, and then you had overcoming with lots of effort, overcome with lots of money, and then physical and mental, so perseverance and so on. I don't have to go through all of this. I just want to see, I hope you're getting the idea. So instead of a tree, it's a circle, and the outer part of the circle are all the virtues. And it's kind of neat because it looks like a cross-section of a tree trunk, doesn't it? And if you have trees, you know that trees start to get sick when their bark is damaged. And in the same way, the human soul gets sick when any one of the virtues is weak. And I think it was St. Ignatius who kind of gave us the visual of our soul is like a castle, and the enemy is going around the castle looking for our weakest point. Our weakest point is a point where the weakest virtue that we have. So growth in spiritual life and growth in human flourishing requires us to identify which is the weakest virtue that I have, and then work on it. Work on it, practice it daily, little steps every day. I just want to share two things for you here. On the left side, an electronic version of the paper that we just handed out, so if you want to download that. And then on the right, there's an app that we developed, we call Grow Virtue. I know it's a little crazy using an app to help you grow in virtue. It's available in the Apple App Store and the Google Play. And what the app does three things. First is it's a diagnostic tool, so you answer a bunch of questions and it will evaluate you on about 25 of the 50 virtues here. The second thing it uses AI, it'll engage you in conversation to help you choose that little thing, that little bite-sized step you're going to take to grow in the virtue that you choose, and you can negotiate with it. So if it suggests something difficult, you can go, that's too difficult, that's something easier, and it'll give you something easier. And then the third thing it'll do is to give you daily reminders. Hey, don't forget you're practicing orderliness today, for example. Anyway, so those are, that's my last slide. 131 slides. You've been very, very patient. Okay, so thank you very much. That's my talk. I've thrown a lot at you, but I'm happy to take any questions, comments, reactions, as you wish. Or not. Yes, sir.
I guess I'm interested in the relationship between you mentioned both willpower and self-discipline. You said that willpower was like a tank, while self-discipline is more like a muscle. Is willpower like something that you need to allot in order to, let's say, grow in self-discipline and be able to strengthen the muscle? Or how are they related? Is that why you take a bite-sized chunk because you don't want your willpower to go all the way down before you are capable of building a virtue? I guess I'm curious about how they relate.
Yeah, you answered your own question. Yeah, by picking a bite-sized, no, you're exactly right, in other words. By picking a bite-sized piece, you're not requiring too much willpower. You need a little bit of willpower to just get going, but you take the smallest possible. I think when people fail at growing the virtue, it's usually because they took too big of a thing, and then they get discouraged. You take a little step, you do that regularly until it becomes a habit, and so it's no longer an effort for you. Then you add another piece to it, another piece, and you're just going to keep growing. All of this, of course, is I didn't even mention grace, right? That's also necessary for growing in virtue. Some pray for the virtue as well. But yeah, that's willpower is largely a limited capacity, whereas we can always grow in virtue. Make sense?
Yes.
Good. Yes.
On one of the slides, I saw the opposite of courage depicted as overly cautious or overcautiousness.
Yes.
Could you maybe talk about a bit of a distinction between that and fear, or why you phrase it as overcautiousness instead of fear?
Yeah, so fear is the emotion that you experience, right? The feeling. Courage is the good habit for dealing with fear, which is accepting the fear and moving forward, the habit of moving forward anyway. The two vices opposed to courage would be cowardliness, right, or overly cautious. And you're just being too driven by that fear. So if you experience the emotion, the virtuous response is move forward anyway. The vicious response on one end is, oh goodness, I'm afraid, I'm just going to run away, or walk away, or avoid it, right? But the other extreme, so that's the defect, and not enough kind of dealing with fear. The other extreme is rashness, right? Where it's just like, I'm afraid, and that's really dangerous, so it's good for me to be afraid, but I'm going to do it anyway, So you're taking not enough respect for fear at that point. Do you see the difference? So fear is the emotion, which we don't really control. We do in the sense that growth in courage is similar to growth in self-discipline, where you're teaching your fears. Okay? So a really easy example is fear of heights. If you suffer from vertigo, suffer from fear of heights, and you stand up on a tall building and you're looking over, say, a balcony or something, and you go, whoa, afraid of heights. You have just strengthened that fear. And the next time, you'll be as afraid, maybe even more. But if you stand there and go, this is very high, I have a funny feeling in my stomach, and I don't care. There I am. And you walk away. The next time you come, it'll be slightly less. And again, and eventually, psychiatrists call this exposure therapy. You expose yourself to the thing you're afraid of in a non-dangerous way, They do it with people who are afraid of spiders. First they show you a picture of a spider, then a video, then a real spider in a glass thing, They don't put a tarantula in front of you the first time. You get killed. But by slow, steady exposure, your fear response changes. Okay, so growing in courage, in a sense, is modifying that fear response. And the two mistakes are to give too much attention to it or too little. But if you give it the right amount of attention and you move forward anyway, that's how you grow in courage. Does that make sense? Good. There's a hand over here. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Abela, for being here.
Sure.
I was trying to overlay as you were going through your presentation, what I was taught in business school around how to achieve, if virtues are the goal, how to achieve the goal. And under this goal setting aspirations, I was taught in business school, make it specific, measurable, achievable, repeatable. And so, and then at the very end, you provided the link to the app. So there truly is an app for that. And thank you for that. I think that really is really helpful.
It is. Yeah, the key thing is the repetition. You mentioned repetition. That's absolutely the key thing. So in order to grow in virtue, you need three things. Right? You have to know about the virtue, right? you have to have virtuous exemplars, examples to look at. And those can be, interestingly, they can be real human beings, they can be literature, so it could be works of fiction, they could be movies. You just need to see this in action, but most importantly, you need to practice it every day, a little bit every day, and then that muscle just gets stronger and stronger. Yeah? Yes?
Could you possibly talk to about a little bit more about the application of prayer in this, and also maybe doing a daily examine?
Yeah, so we'll start with the examine, right? It's a useful examination of conscience to go through the different virtues and see, okay. But here's the thing to watch out for. Too often we fall into thinking of the virtues as external standards. Things I can measure myself again. Have I been courageous? Have I been grateful? Have I been, Don't stop there. Right? You have to remember that they are internal muscles. I'm speaking analogously, but it's useful to think of them as muscles. So they're not just external standards, they're things that I have to exercise within myself, to make them stronger. In terms of the role of prayer, there's an analogy from John of St. Thomas, a medieval theologian, and he says growing in virtue is like rowing a boat. So you're rowing, and you get stronger as you row. He says, but then when grace comes into it, it's like hoisting a sail. So the boat is still moving, probably moving faster, moving in the same direction with less effort on your part. And that's grace. And so actually Aquinas lines up the 7 gifts of the Spirit with the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 theological virtues. Not exactly, there's a little overlap, but grace is a necessary part of growing in virtue, which is why the Aristotelian project fails, right? Because they didn't have grace, well, not the way we do, and so they couldn't really, you can't grow to the fullness of virtue without God's grace. And so with the theological virtues, I think you know this, you can only grow in them through grace. I can't will myself to practice charity, and grow in charity. That's God's going to give me that. Now I want to cooperate with that, But all the other virtues, through practice, grace helps, but we also have to do our bit as well, through practicing, through kind of this daily repetition.